James Reeb, January 1, 1927, March 11, 1965, was an American Unitarian Universalist minister, pastor, and activist during the Civil Rights Movement in Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts. While participating in the Selma to Montgomery March's actions in Selma, Alabama, in 1965, he was murdered by white segregationists, dying of head injuries in the hospital 2 days after being severely beaten. 3 men were tried for Reeb's murder, but were acquitted by an all-white jury. His murder remains officially unsolved. Life and career. Reeb was born on January 1, 1927, in Wichita, Kansas, to May Fox and Harry Reeb. He was raised in Kansas and Casper, Wyoming. He attended Natrona County High School and graduated in 1945, after which he joined the Army despite the fact that his commitment to the ministry made him exempt from service. After basic training, he was sent to Anchorage, Alaska as a clerk typist for the headquarters of Special Troops. He was honorably discharged 18 months later in December 1946 as Technical Sergeant, 3rd Class. After his time in the Army, Reeb continued his schooling. Initially, he attended classes in his hometown at Casper Junior College, before moving on to St. Olaf College in 1947, where he received his A.B. cum laude in 1950. He then entered Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey, where he earned his B.D. in 1953. 3 days later, Reeb was ordained a Presbyterian minister at the First Presbyterian Church of Casper. After this he accepted a position at the Philadelphia General Hospital as chaplain to hospitals for the Philadelphia Presbyter. To become a more effective counselor, he went back to school, enrolling at Conwell School of Theology, where he earned an STM in Pastoral Counseling in 1955. As a scholar of theology, Reeb grew away from traditionalist Presbyterian teachings and was drawn to the Unitarian Universalist Church. In March 1957, he resigned his Presbyterian chaplaincy and contacted the American Unitarian Association about transferring his fellowship from Presbyterian to Unitarian. Reeb appreciated the church's emphasis on social action, and he became active in the civil rights movement during the 1960s. Beginning in his new ministry, Reeb encouraged parishioners to participate in the movement as well. With his wife and 4 children, he lived in poor black neighborhoods where he felt he could do the most good. He took a job that would allow him to work closely with Philadelphia's poor community as youth director for the West Branch YMCA between 1957 and 1959. While at the YMCA, he abolished the racial quota system and started an integrated busing program to transport youth to and from the location. When he was granted preliminary fellowship by the Unitarians, he accepted an offer to be assistant minister of All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. After 3 years of active service at All Souls Church, Reeb was fully ordained as a Unitarian Universalist minister in 1962. In 1964, he began as Community Relations Director for the American Friends Service Committee's Boston Metropolitan Housing Program, focusing on desegregation. At the AFSC, Reeb and his staff advocated for the poor and pressed the city to enforce its housing code, protecting the rights of tenants of all races and backgrounds, particularly poor African and Hispanic Americans. The Reebs were one of the few white families living in Roxbury. James Reeb's daughter Anne recollected that her father was adamant that you could not make a difference for African Americans while living comfortable in a white community. Reeb married Marie Deason on August 20, 1950. They had 4 children. Murder. As a member of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, Reeb went to Selma to join the Selma to Montgomery marches, a series of protests for African American voting rights, following the attack by state troopers and sheriff's deputies on nonviolent demonstrators on March 7, 1965. After eating dinner at an integrated restaurant on March 9, Reeb and 2 other Unitarian ministers, Reverend Clark Olson and Reverend Orloff Miller, were beaten by white men with clubs for their support of African American rights. The black hospital in Selma did not have the facilities to treat him, and the white hospital refused. 2 hours elapsed, and his condition deteriorated, before Reeb arrived at a Birmingham hospital. Treatment was not available for him in much closer Montgomery, where doctors performed brain surgery. While Reeb was on his way to the hospital in Birmingham, civil rights leader Martin Luther King, Jr. addressed a press conference lamenting the cowardly attack and asking all to pray for his protection. Reeb went into a coma and died 2 days later from his injuries. His death resulted in a national outcry against the activities of white racists in the Deep South. Reeb's death provoked mourning throughout the country, and tens of thousands held vigils in his honor. President Lyndon B. Johnson called Reeb's widow and father to express his condolences, and on March 15 invoked Reeb's memory when he delivered a draft of the Voting Rights Act to Congress. The same day, King eulogized Reeb at a ceremony at Brown's Chapel in Selma. James Reeb symbolizes the forces of goodwill in our nation. He demonstrated the conscience of the nation. He was an attorney for the defense of the innocent in the court of world opinion. He was a witness to the truth that men of different races and classes might live, eat, and work together as brothers. And part of King's eulogy for James Reeb, he said, James Reeb says something to each of us, black and white alike, says that we must substitute courage for caution, says to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him but about the system, the way of life. In April 1965, 4 men, Elmer Cook, William Stanley Hoggle, Naaman O'Neal Hoggle, and R.B. Kelly, were indicted in Dallas County, Alabama for Reeb's murder. 3 were acquitted by an all-white jury that December. The 4th man fled to Mississippi and was not returned by the state authorities for trial. The Voting Rights Act was passed on August 6, 1965. In July 2007, the Boston Globe reported that the FBI's Cold Case Initiative had reopened the investigation into the 46-year-old case. The renewed investigation was also reported by the Anniston Star and the Clarion Ledger of Jackson, Mississippi. However, in 2011 the case was closed again, and no charges were pursued. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, the decision to close the case was made upon discovery that 3 of the 4 men believed to be responsible for the killing were deceased and that Naaman Hoggle, the only surviving individual, was tried and acquitted of the crime in state court, which barred him from further prosecution. Naaman Hoggle died 5 years later on August 31, 2016, at age 81. National Public Radio Investigation investigative journalists from NPR, Andrew Beck Grace and Chip Brantley, conducted a multi-year investigation and published their findings in a podcast, White Lies, in May and June 2019. During their investigation, Grace and Brantley found an eyewitness, Francis Bowden, and a 4th man, William Portwood, who was involved in the crime. Portwood had not previously been identified. Grace and Brantley interviewed William Portwood in 2017. At that time, Portwood had suffered from strokes and was experiencing memory lapses. However, he was able to remember having been there. "All I did was kick one of them," Portwood said. Francis Bowden is the proprietor of Selma Bail Bonds, which was located adjacent to the crime scene. After the death of Naaman Hoggle, and learning that William Portwood had admitted to being involved, Bowden gave an account of what she saw that night from the window of her business. In summary, she stated that Elmer Cook, William Stanley Hoggle, Duck Hoggle, and William Portwood assaulted Reverends Reeb, Olson, and Miller. It was Elmer Cook who swung the club and struck Reverend Reeb. William Portwood died shortly after his last interview with NPR on September 30, 2017. Media portrayals. Reeb is portrayed by Jeremy Strong in the film Selma, 2014. See also: List of unsolved murders. References. External links: Martin Luther King Jr.'s eulogy for James Reeb, Unitarian Universalist World, interview with 2 Reeb children, who talk about their father's effect on the civil rights movement, HMB Review, The 12th of November 2008. Anderson, Laura. James Reeb. March 16, 2009. Encyclopedia of Alabama. Retrieved the 9th of March 2013. James Reeb. Harvard Square Library. Reeb, James, 1927–1965, Martin Luther King Jr., and the Global Freedom Struggle. Martin Luther King, Jr. A Witness to the Truth, PDF. UU World. Archive from the original PDF on June 11, 2012. Retrieved March 9, 2013. The Reverend Clark Olson's Memories of the Murder of Jim Reeb in Selma in 1965. Unitarian Universalist World. James Reeb, The King Center. Clark Olson still weeps over killing of fellow minister, March 11, 2011, in Unpunished Killings, by Jerry Mitchell. James Reeb, Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. Ferris State University. Dr. King leads march at Selma. State police end it peaceably. The New York Times on the web. Who is James Reeb? James Reeb. Unitarian Universalist congregation touched by their family history. Reverend James Reeb's granddaughters Leah Reeb and Corey Lubnow have traveled to Selma to better understand his convictions and his sacrifice made in Wyoming. Our legacy of success.